Historical Jesus Part 2. Last time we stopped talking about criteria. Now, why did scholars start coming up with criteria? What was the problem that criteria were intended to address?
Give a stable set of criteria. Give a stable set of data that everybody could agree on, so that Jesus would just be subjective.
Okay, so, yeah, objectivity. It was an attempt to provide some objectivity to the process. Why did you need objectivity? What was Schweitzer's paradox? Yeah. Schweitzer, chronicled the first quest and pointed out that people basically found whatever they went looking for. Right? Those who were skeptics found a cheat and a fraud. Those who were believers found somebody who looked remarkably like them. As he says at one point, they went looking for Jesus and found a mirror. The problem with this, though, is that then what becomes the test for authenticity? Well, if what you find is not useful to you and is not useful to your faith, right? Well, who wants to spend a lot of time investigating stuff that's not going to be useful to you in your faith? And so what happened was the scholars, the top scholars, Galatians is starting later tonight, Dorothy.
What time?
9 o'clock.
Okay. And for how long?
Go to 11:30.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry.
No problem. You're welcome to sit in if you want, but.
That's okay.
Yes. So what happened was scholars kind of started focusing on the Christ of faith. The Christ that you meet in worship and in your private devotions and in prayer. But what's the problem with that? Well, when the Christ of faith becomes divorced from the Jesus of history, you can shape it into whatever you want. And this ultimately, the ultimate manifestation of this, of course, was Nazi Germany, where Jesus becomes the ultimate anti-Semite who is overseeing the extermination of the Jewish people.
They were taking out whole portions of the Bible and rewriting the Bible.
Yeah, and so Ernst Käsemann, who was German, student of Rudolf Bultmann, said, time out, we've gone wildly astray here somewhere. We need to find a way to ground our understanding of Jesus in the bedrock of history. Okay? And so he came up with this idea of criteria. And again, the purpose was to introduce some objectivity so that you could get beyond Schweitzer's paradox, where the only way to show that you're in touch with something authentic is to find something that's completely irrelevant and not useful. Okay? Because the charge, if you found something useful, was where you just found that because that's what you were looking for. And so you shaped the evidence to make it look that way. So we went through and we talked about several criteria. And we looked at the historicity of Jesus' baptism. Right? Remember we went through and talked about that. For the weekly task this time, you were looking at whether or not Jesus talked about the 12. All right, what did people think? Well, let's go. How many people think Jesus did historically talk about the 12? All right, how many think he did not, and that was an invention of the early church? All right. Someone make a case for one of those. Why is it historical, or why was it an invention of the early church?
12 was a representation of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Okay, so there's a connection to the Old Testament. Does that help prove historicity or potentially argue against it?
I think it's an argument that direction.
Does it help prove it?
Not necessarily.
Why?
Because it could be something that's constructed by the Christian to try to
Yes. Yes, it could be. They thought, we want to connect this with Israel, so we'll make him say 12. Right? They have an incentive to make that connection, and so that doesn't actually help establish historicity. Does that make sense? Because they could have just shaped it in that way to help you make that connection. All right, Frederick.
It makes sense, but I went back to like in each of the Gospels, they talked about when he chose the 12, they talked about the 12, talked about the inner circle. That's how I saw it when I said
Okay, so what criteria are you going to appeal to?
the criteria of more than one and more than one source.
Multiple attestation, okay? So what are your multiple, and what is the thing about multiple attestation? What do you have to have?
Independent sources.
Independent sources, okay? So how many independent sources do we have confirming that Jesus talked about the 12?
Four Gospels is number one, each one is separate.
They're separate, but are they independent?
Oh, you talking about like Josephus and other things like that? Other books of history.
Well, potentially, I mean, that would count, but does Josephus talk about Jesus talking about his 12 disciples?
Oh, I'm just.
He doesn't. Yeah, but if he did, then yeah, that you could bring that in. But what's the problem with the Gospels? Yeah, they all, it depends in part on how you solve the synoptic problem, right? If you like the 2 or 4 source model where you've got Mark and Q, well, then you can potentially pair things from Mark and Q and say that, they're independent early sources. And then you have the Matthew stuff that's going to be independent from Luke by definition. But something that's in Mark and Matthew and Luke, well, that's all coming from Mark in most solutions of the synoptic problem. So how many independent sources do you have? One. And what about John? Well, it depends. Did John know the synoptics? Well, we talked about that. Maybe, maybe not. If not, then okay, maybe you have an independent source, and maybe John's account is different enough that it seems independent. He's not getting it from the synoptics. But it can be difficult to argue multiple attestation if all you have are the Gospels, right?
So what about if, like, the epistles, if one of the epistles, say, Paul talks about the 12?
Does he?
But if he did, I'm just saying.
Well, I'm asking, does he?
Only thing he mentioned, he said,
He
I'm
doesn't say 12 specific.
I'm one of the apostles at a late time.
Where is that?
Mm,
Where is that?
That Acts, right?
No.
Not Acts.
But when Paul had to go back and they had to meet
It's
about,
in Corinthians, right?
1 Corinthians 15.
okay, so that'll be a fruitful.
1 Corinthians 15:5.
That's the only place I saw him say anything about it, but he didn't say a number. Said one of.
Now, is Paul potentially getting this from the Gospels?
No, this is personal experience.
Yeah, he's not getting this from. Remember, Paul's letters are probably all written before the Gospels are written. The Gospels are all later than Paul's letters. So he's going through talking about those to whom Christ appeared after he was raised. 15. 1 Corinthians 15. I'll start with verse 3. For I've delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as it were, to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. Okay? So Paul does refer to the 12. All right? Now, does Paul have a good reason to invent that?
No.
Why?
Because it's an embarrassment thing.
If he was written before the gospel, he wouldn't have no recollection of the 12 if it all was written.
Okay, yeah, so he's not getting it from the Gospels because he's writing before the Gospels are there. So he's providing some evidence that there were a group known as the 12. But how do we know Paul's not just making that up to correspond to the Old Testament?
He's not getting it out. It's
Because
not
he was
in
the
his
last.
interest. It's not in his interest.
Why?
To deny it, because it makes him look, it was a sacrifice for him to turn on his training because he had been a persecutor of the Jews.
Okay, good. If anything, it reminds people he's not one of them, right? You got the 12, and then there's Paul, right? So this does not help, improve his stature or anything like that. He's not benefiting from referencing the 12, right? And he's actually not making any connections to Israel or doing anything with that there either. He's just kind of in an offhand way, and he appeared to the 12, which presumably everybody knows who that is. Also, what else is awkward about this? How many of the 12 are still around at this point?
Everybody except Judas, right? Because Judas died.
Judas died. Why did he say the 11?
Because in the scripture talking about that they chose Matthew, but Paul was the one that should have been chosen. There's some scripture in there. I read it. It's in the Bible.
There are some interpreters. Oh, what wonderful things in the Bible I see. Some put there by you, some put there by me. That's one of those things that's been put in there by someone else. Yes. Yes. Yeah, I had a professor that had that view that they messed up when they selected Mattathias. It was supposed to be Paul, but the scripture doesn't actually say that.
Well, he says, he appeared to the 12 after he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Now, is he talking about the 500 brethren, or is he talking about the 12?
Some of the 12.
I think at that point he's talking about the 500.
I thought it was talking about sort of like Emmaus.
But the point is, by this point, one of the 12 is no longer there, right? Judas is gone. But you don't see them suddenly talking about the 11.
But Jesus eventually picked 12.
Okay, good. And so why would Paul, even after Judas has done this, why would Paul still refer to the 12? Well, probably because Jesus, well, yeah, but he wouldn't have been one of them who he appeared to, because he wasn't still hanging out with them. He was on the outs after
It
all.
would indicate then that there had been,
The election took
it was
place.
like you understood in the sentence that there were actually 12 and that people referred to them all.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
they would still say 12, they just wouldn't say Jews.
Right. Just like, they still talk about the Big Ten, if you follow sports, college sports.
Oh, yeah.
Well, how many teams are in the Big Ten?
3 now, probably.
11, 12. I mean, it's more than 10, right? But we still call it the Big Ten because when it got named, it had 10.
That would be historical what he's talking about, 12.
Yeah. Now you see the same thing in Acts, right? Because we have to select someone to fill in the number, so we have 12, right? What about embarrassment or awkwardness? Is there anything embarrassing or awkward about the 12?
Who chose you?
Yeah, if you were going to make up a story, would you have the guy who's supposed to be, Mr. Sinless, Mr. Insightful, Mr. On top of everything, get betrayed by one of his closest advisors?
Yeah.
No.
The one that was close.
Yeah.
If I was
Yeah.
writing it, I would be my training too.
I mean, well, but would you create that kind of a story? I mean, you may have to deal with it, right? And so they do kind of Jesus, he knows beforehand this is going to happen, and so there are ways of dealing. But if you were making up a story, would you include that kind of wrinkle? Probably not, because it doesn't make Jesus look very good, right? Now again, you have ways of dealing with it, and the Gospels do. But that's not the kind of thing you would make up if you're trying to promote your cause. Does that make sense?
I agree with that.
So based on these two, most scholars conclude that Jesus probably did talk about the 12. Okay? And once you've established that, then you can go back and think, well, why would he do that? Well, because there's this connection with the Old Testament and setting up, the 12, which E.P. Sanders, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, but how many of you heard that Jesus kind of takes on Israel's role? You see that some like in N.T. Wright and all that. Sanders says, no, Jesus isn't taking on Israel's role. It's the disciples. Because they're the 12. They're the ones who correspond to Israel, not Jesus. So, yeah. Yeah, and they're the ones who are going to sit on the thrones and judge Israel.
So it would be that,
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that, but I was thinking it was more like Jesus taught the 12, and then the 12 went out and did the work. Because, the scripture always talks about they were Christian, unlearned men. So they had to learn these things about the gospel, about the plan and will of God. And then Jesus took them aside many times to just talk to them. Because they didn't understand it just like people. But then the scripture would take them aside and explain it more to them so they could understand.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I looked at it. That they did the work, but they couldn't have done that work if Jesus had not poured it to them.
Right, yeah. So, Jesus is equipping the 12 so they can then equip, others. And then, yeah. But the point is, why 12? And the obvious connection is with the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, what does that say? Is Jesus founding a new Israel? Or what is going on? Is he renewing Israel through these 12? What is he trying to signify by calling them the 12? And if you notice, the names are a bit different in each gospel. So what's up with that? Well, some have argued that maybe, Greek names and Hebrew names, and people would have two names. That's possible. E.P. Sanders, again, suggests what was important was the number 12, not so much who it was. And so it could even have been a rotating kind of thing. So, someone gets word that, their dad died and they need to go back. Okay, you go on, next man up. Right? Kind of like when Judas leaves the scene. All right, who's up next? Mattathias, come on down. You're the next contestant on... yes.
One of the reasons what threw me off was when you talk about the points of the similarity, and if you think about the 12, if the church agrees and Jesus agrees, and that's supposed to be the deacons.
Mm-hmm. Right. So again, arguing on the grounds that 12 corresponds to the 12 tribes is not a strong argument for historicity. That's a weak argument. Because there's always the danger the church just kind of introduced that to make that connection because it benefits the church. Right? So you're absolutely right. That is not a strong argument for historicity. You can't argue for the historicity because it corresponds to something in the Old Testament. Does that make sense? That doesn't mean it's not historical. It just means that's not a sufficient kind of argument to establish the point. Just because if Paul hadn't said it, it wouldn't mean that it wasn't historical. It just means you can't use multiple attestation to establish it. Does that make sense?
More than one source.
Yeah, and that's actually a problem that's going to come up with these criteria. There may be a few deeds or a few sayings that you can actually apply them and get some results that seem pretty credible. But in the majority of the case, what's your answer going to be? I don't know. Yeah. Because it's not something that's extremely embarrassing or something that, is multiply attested or so is it historical? Well, I don't know. Maybe Jesus said it, but I can't establish that because history is not very good at the tools of history are not good for establishing specifics about individuals. They're much better at establishing trends and what was the general culture like. Not did Jesus go to Mary's house on Tuesday at 11 a.m.
So in terms of establishing a trend, what would be the fact that in the Hebrew Bible there's a section called the 12. So this whole concept that every Jewish household was aware of at the time the 12 apostles were called, and the 12 tribes. So the number 12 was, I think, the
Yeah, 12 had significance in Jewish culture,
right.
which again, and the church made a lot of that, right? The church plays up those connections. So again, you have something in Judaism, something that's purported to be in Jesus, and something that the church continues on. That's not a strong argument from dissimilarity because the church has a vested interest in having put that in.
Okay.
But again, if you can establish it on other grounds that it's likely historical, then you can ask about, well, why would Jesus do this? What is the connection that he's trying to make? And then you can run with that. Okay, does that make sense?
Which is why I'm never going to become a historian.
Working on historical Jesus stuff is maddening because you can't assume anything and everything you've got to, prove from the ground up. But how do you prove it from the ground up? Because you have to question all of your assumptions, and it just gets ridiculous at times. You still look a little.
Well, because, I really missed the boat on this one, and I'm kind of, because I was trying to follow the criteria, so, I mean, in my heart, I feel like, but, the criteria, so we didn't meet the similarity criteria, but we had it on multiple attestation.
So you can make an argument from multiple attestation because you have Paul doing it. And then, these two special forms of dissimilarity, because it would be kind of embarrassing that Judas was one of the 12 and he betrayed him, and the awkwardness. So then you've got to deal with that. And but you still are calling them the 12, but he's no longer there. So you got to find ways of dealing with that too. And you even have Paul still calling them the 12, right? In a place where it doesn't really help his cred to do that. And again, at least one of the 12 is now gone, a very prominent member of the 12, and yet we're still calling them the 12.
Well, would it be because Jesus called the 12?
Well, that's the argument. I mean, why would they be doing this if Jesus hadn't done it? Why would you make up this kind of story and introduce these complications to it? And how would you do that in a way that even Paul can just kind of throw, oh yeah, the 12?
But Dr. Trick being said, okay, we'll call it the 12, Paul called them 12, and then you say, well, the names are different. Would this be like sort of building our case? Yeah, the names are different because somebody went home to the funeral, they said next man step up, it was still 12, so the name didn't matter, but it's 12.
Right, so that's
All
one.
that build, like,
That's one way of explaining it. Yeah,
oh, okay.
yeah, that's one way of explaining it.
They chose the 12. They walked back in.
And it really would have been confusing if Paul had said the 10.
Who's
Who's
that?
It was 12.
Yeah.
Now he's calls it ruckus, for our understanding. We understand.
Yeah. So you still continue to call them the 12. And again, the disciples in Acts, same issue. We need someone else to step up because we got to be 12. And what you learn in Acts, there were a group of people who had been with Jesus the whole time that were not part of the 12. They were disciples. They had been with him the whole time, such that any one of them could have stepped up at that point and become one of the 12.
Is that like the 70 he set out to cast out?
Yeah. Connecting back to the table of nations in Genesis, where there are 70 nations listed. Right? So that numbers are always significant. You got to think about, why are we using these numbers? And there's always the possibility that the numbers have been introduced to make connections as opposed to historicity. Does that make sense? So it could be Jesus sent out 70, or they could have just said 70 in order to make the connection with the Genesis account. Right? And how do you know the difference? Well, again, from this vantage point, it's very hard to definitively prove one way or the other. And so, you end up with I don't know.
Just take my word.
Yeah. Frederick said it, so it's
Oh, don't
good
use
enough.
my name.
I heard a God. Right? All right, so what I want to do now is go through some of the big names in this field, in historical Jesus, and kind of talk about what their Jesus ends up looking like and the method that they use. All right? How many people have heard of the Jesus Seminar?
Yes.
The Jesus Seminar, yeah, they were big back in the
That
80s.
group of men that got together and they come together and they try to come up with the answer to the history of Jesus.
Yeah, it was a group of scholars that got together, most of them liberal-leaning, most of them from not big names, kind of from second-tier schools and all of that. There were a few big names that were associated at the top, but many of them were not. And they decided they were going to come together, and their big thing was they wanted to bridge the divide between the academy and the church. Because they said there's a gulf between what is done in the academy and what goes on in the church. You may have noticed this. And so what they wanted to do, everything they did was geared toward making the biggest splash in the media. Okay? So what were their principles? Well, they decided they were going to consider all sources. They're not going to limit themselves to the canonical sources. So Gospel of Thomas, for example, played a big role in a lot of what they did. What they would do is they started with Jesus' sayings, and they went through all of his sayings and determined, they would assign them to different people. Those people would go research it. They would come back. They would present papers. And then after they'd had some discussion, they would vote. And how did they vote? Well, they had colored beads. Yeah. Red meant it was authentic. Yep, this is Jesus. Pink meant maybe. Could be Jesus. Gray. Yeah, and there's some question. Does gray mean maybe, or does it mean probably not? There's some ambiguity there as to what gray actually signified. And then black, no way. No way. This is not Jesus at all. Their findings. What? Yeah. What percentage of sayings would you guess they found of Jesus, sayings attributed to Jesus were actually authentic?
Not yet.
I'm gonna guess 50%.
50%?
That's my guess.
20%?
13. That's a good number.
And the winner is.
And the winner is Frederick for being underneath. 18%. 18% of the sayings attributed to Jesus were authentic. And most of these that they decided were authentic were of the generic proverbial wisdom type. So, for example, the one that got the highest score of authenticity is Matthew 5:39. Which says, "But I say to you, do not resist him who is evil, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also." That is the most authentic saying we have of Jesus, according to the Jesus Seminar.
That was supposed to be used to justify.
And number two is the one... Number two is the one that comes right after it. "And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also." And then one from Luke sneaks in, but then the third one is the verse right after that. "And whoever shall force you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Right? And so these are the kind of sayings that they prefer. Right? This kind of general... So they... Yeah, the picture of Jesus that emerges from the Jesus Seminar is of kind of a wandering cynic or sage who just kind of, wanders around spouting out these little aphorisms.
They're basing it on the laws during that time.
Well, they're basing it on their internal discussions. And one of the critiques of this is that things that they take as operating assumptions were things that should have been conclusions. So, for example, one of their operating assumptions is that there's very little historical in John. Well, shouldn't that be a conclusion, not an assumption going in? Yeah, and not surprisingly, we'll see in a minute, how many sayings do you think they found authentic in John? 0. Nothing in John goes back to Jesus.
What was the Son of Hell? What year was
It
this?
was back in the 80s. They met several times. Then they would, go for the big newspaper headlines, and they published a New Testament that had everything, color coded in red, pink, gray, and black. And so,
In the 80s?
yeah.
1980s.
Yeah. I mean, they were also critiqued for some of the people that they had on their committee. So one of the people on here was Paul Verhoeven, who's the director of Basic Instinct and Showgirls, and somebody said, well, what are his qualifications for voting on what Jesus said and did? Yeah. So the Academy generally has not been all that thrilled with Jesus Seminar, but the media loves them. This is where the Time Magazine Easter issue started. With the latest scandalous revelations about Jesus that come out every year. After they went through all of his sayings, then they moved on to his deeds, and they found that 16% of the deeds attributed to Jesus were probably authentic. And one of their operating assumptions, if it's unverifiable, that means it's inauthentic. In other words, if you cannot prove it's historical, then it must be inauthentic. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, most of these things you wind up with I don't have a provable case either way. And so for the Jesus Seminar, that means, well, that's inauthentic. That's not authentic. Yeah.
Nobody's keeping, where did they come from?
They just want somebody to listen. They need an audience.
So here are their findings. With regard to the sayings, there are 420 sayings of Jesus in Matthew. 11 of them they found to be authentic. 60 probably authentic, 115 probably not, and 234 absolutely not.
Yeah,
They researched the scrolls and all the ancient things that they found, so they went back that far.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, they came up with reasons for why they came to these conclusions. One of the things you're going to see as we go through this is and one of the critiques of the criteria, they're not really as objective as they seem. They're easily manipulable. And you can use the criteria to kind of justify whatever you want. Yeah.
It seemed like if it fit today, if it fit them today, that's what they went by.
Exactly. The Jesus that emerges from the Jesus Seminar looks a lot like the people who were in the Jesus Seminar. He has the same concerns. He doesn't do things like eschatology, because they don't really like eschatology. So Jesus must not have liked eschatology. And it's the Schweitzer problem all over again. Out of Mark, 177 sayings, 1 is authentic. 18 probably, 66 probably not, and 92 absolutely not. Luke, 392 sayings, 14 of which are authentic, 65 probably, 128 probably not, and 185 absolutely not. John, 0 authentic sayings in John. 1 maybe authentic, 5 probably not, and 134 of the 140 absolutely not. But again, what's their operating assumption? Very little in John is historical. If that's your assumption going in, is this a surprising result? No. Gospel of Thomas, which they like, 201 sayings, has more authentic sayings than John and Mark put together with 3. 40 probably, 67 probably not, and 91 no way.
They say why?
Yeah, I mean, you can go and they give you their reasons and all of this. Yeah. Yes.
Everton Gospel. From reading in the New Testament,
Mm-hmm.
and I read it in about 17 to explain the way this heard of this gospel? Have you seen
Well, there are other gospels out there.
it? Yes, I know, but you think this was entwined into this, evidence?
Me personally, yeah, I mean, they're looking at everything out there, and they're saying that a lot of this stuff was earlier and more reliable than the canonical gospels. I think that's a problematic assumption as well. I mean, I think the canonical gospels are probably our best, entree into who Jesus was, not all this other stuff, that much of which is later. So again, kind of what you start with as your operating assumptions goes a long way towards deciding what your ultimate conclusion is going to be. And the hope when they came up with criteria was that, now we've got these objective criteria, we can now kind of converge and come to a consensus about what Jesus was really like and what he did. There's still just as many portraits of Jesus as there are scholars writing about it. We haven't gotten any closer to consensus. And again, the reason is because the criteria, you can kind of manipulate them to make them say whatever you want. John Dominic Crossan. He was a member of the Jesus Seminar, but he also kind of does his own independent stuff. You can find him often on the History Channel or the Discovery Channel doing a lot of the documentaries about, Palestine in the first century. He's very keen on method. You got to have a good method, and his method, on the surface seems pretty good. He starts out and assigns every piece of evidence. So he goes through all these different gospels and assigns it a source strata and the number of independent attestation. Okay, so if you had something, a tradition or whatever is saying that was 1-4, that would mean it comes from the earliest strata and is multiply attested in 4 different things. So that would be a really good score. Does that make sense? So he goes through and scores everything.
Okay.
Then he says you've got to put Jesus in a reconstruction of the first century in the Greco-Roman Jewish world. Now, Crossan particularly emphasizes the Greco-Roman aspect of that. So his book is, Jesus, a Mediterranean Peasant.
Okay.
I would suggest the Jewish side of that equation is probably a bit more important than the Greco-Roman side, but he emphasizes the Greco-Roman. And then he says that we need to employ social cultural anthropology to Jesus' actions to try to make sense of what happened. Okay? Now, again, that seems like a pretty good method. You assign everything, then you kind of evaluate and whatnot. But again, you can manipulate it based on how you define your strata and what you put in it. So Crossan's earliest strata includes Q, most of Thomas, and something he's reconstructed that he calls the cross gospel.
Okay.
Others call it the Crossan gospel. Yeah. So this isn't even something that we found. It's something he reconstructed from something we found. Right?
So when he says strata, he means the earliest stuff.
Yeah, dating. So if you think of like an archaeological dig, you can go down, you've got different strata. And so he's treating it like that. So the earliest strata would be the earliest stuff we have. So maybe he would say earliest stuff is anything before 60. And then the next strata would be, anything 60 to 100. I mean, I don't remember exactly what his cutoff are, but that kind of thing. And so you go through and you date all this stuff. But again, what you decide is early is going to have a big influence on the Jesus you get out. And the Jesus you think you're looking for is going to influence what you think is early.
Exactly.
Right? So what does his Jesus look like? Well, he says Jesus started out as an apocalyptic disciple of John, but later broke with him. How do we know he broke with him? Well, because in Matthew he says John is the least of those in the kingdom.
He used that to say.
Yep, that's the meaning of that. John got struck off the Christmas card list. He's not getting one anymore. All right, and his Jesus, do you know what Jesus' main issue was? For Crossan? Yeah.
According to him, Jesus' main issue.
Yeah, what is it Jesus was all about? No. Brokerage. Brokerage, yes, brokerage. Mediated hierarchy. So the key concept that Jesus was trying to get across, and the way he tried to do it was through magic and meals, is to usher in a brokerless kingdom in which everyone has direct access to God. So what Jesus is pushing against is this brokerage system in which it goes from God to the high priest to the priests to the men to the women to the Gentiles. Jesus is trying to break down that system, that hierarchy. You remember when we had not in Judaism, not in Jesus, not in the church? And I said, Sandra said, that's Crossan's Jesus. Right? So how did Jesus, fight against this brokerage system? Well, through magic, and he's very careful to call it magic, not miracles. Because miracles are acts of power that come through officially sanctioned channels. Magic is the stuff that gets done on the side streets, on the slot. Yeah, and so what Jesus is doing is magic. Because, someone comes up and says, oh, my leg is really hurting me today. I better go to Jerusalem and get a priest to pray. No, you don't have to do that. God can heal you right here, right now. And he does.
Come over here.
Right. And so he's breaking it down by doing magic that convinces people, you can interact with God just as you are. And through meals. Do what? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And then through meals, because he would eat with anybody and everybody. He didn't discriminate. Right?
Because he would eat anybody.
Yeah.
And these folks trying to shut me down here, I ain't think about nothing. I want to know, what do you mean by magic and meals, please?
Right, what I just said.
Because I'm not clear on how that, on that particular, I mean, magic, I can understand it's a miracle, but when you say the meals, are you saying that they're only be concerned about when he fed 5,000?
No.
Okay,
The meals are the fact that Jesus would eat with anybody. He wouldn't eat only with his caste or his clique. So he's breaking down the hierarchies, and it doesn't matter who you are, you can come eat with me.
Okay.
And I'll come eat with you.
Okay.
Who's this guy? I can't read.
John Dominic Crossan. Crossan.
If you are maybe looking at it with a wider lens, you would say that yes, that's exactly what he did. You just said.
Well, yeah. So I mean, there's Crossan's pointing to stuff in the literature, in the Gospels, in the Bible to make his case. The question is whether you think really brokerage is what Jesus' big issue was.
Right.
And now it's interesting. He's a former priest, Crossan, not Jesus.
So he came out of the priesthood.
Yeah. He decided it actually wasn't for him. And what do you know? His Jesus is someone who doesn't like hierarchy and priests and so I mean you can see. By the way, what happened to Jesus' body? It was eaten by dogs. He was eaten by dogs. Yeah, eaten by dogs. Now, he admits that's hypothetical, but that's his whole point. We don't know. It could just as easily have been eaten by dogs.
Real tough fall.
Yeah, I know you're all going to want to go out and buy his books now, so you can preach on Sunday. So, moving on. E.P. Sanders, he was one of my professors at Duke. He starts not with sayings, but with deeds. And says, can we come up with a list of deeds that we can, pretty confidently say Jesus did, and then build from there. And so what falls on his list? Well, Jesus was baptized by John, as we talked about. We talked about that. Jesus called 12 disciples, or he called disciples and spoke of them being 12. He confined his activity to Israel. He wasn't going out and ministering to Gentiles and Gentile lands. He was a Galilean who preached and healed. Right? Even his rabbinic opponents admit, he was a miracle worker.
Okay.
And so one of Sanders' criteria is, the good things that your enemies say about you are probably historical or reliable, because why would they say that if it wasn't true? Yeah. He engaged in controversy about the temple. He was crucified outside Jerusalem by Roman authorities. And after his death, his followers continued as an identifiable movement. And then finally, at least some Jews persecuted at least some parts of this new movement. Okay? Now, Sanders is someone who is very good at thinking through practicalities. So he's always asking, well, how would that have really worked out? So, for example, the temple controversy. You remember Jesus goes in and overturns tables, and so Sanders points out, well, that outer court is huge. Huge. There's no way one person can stop all traffic in that outer court. Also, how is Jesus able to do this without the Roman guards showing up and putting a stop to it? I mean, if this was something that spanned the whole court, surely Rome would have gotten involved pretty quickly. So Sanders says that can't be what happened. What this must have been was a prophetic demonstration, small-scale prophetic demonstration of the coming destruction. Right? In other words, it's a prophetic act. He goes over and flips over some tables in a small section as a sign of the destruction that was about to come to the whole. All right? Which means, what do we usually call it? The cleansing of the temple? It's not cleansing at all. It's not, if you just clean this up, then we'll be good. No, he's saying you missed your shot. And now it's time for judgment to come. Okay, does that make sense?
So if it wasn't clean the temple because you turned over the table, that bigger.
Yes. The next scholar is John Meyer. He was at Notre Dame. He was writing a commentary on Matthew, and as part of his introductory stuff, he realized he needed to deal with historical Jesus, and I think he's now 6 or 7 volumes in, each one, several hundred pages, and he's still going.
What's his name again?
John Meyer, Meier. He and Sanders are probably the closest two on this list. He suggests, or his method is to use an unpapal conclave. What does he mean? Well, he says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a thought experiment. We're going to take a Jew, a Protestant, a Catholic, and an atheist and lock them in the basement at Harvard Divinity School and tell them they cannot come out until they have agreed what Jesus was like.
Oh my God.
Next person standing.
So they're still there, right?
They're still there. And so what he does is for each point that's being considered, he says, okay, how would a Jew perceive this? How would a Catholic regard this? How would the atheist regard this? How would the Protestant regard this? And if you can find something that they would all agree on, then you're likely in touch with something that's historical. Okay? Now, Meyer is also honest in admitting that the historical Jesus is going to be different than the real Jesus. In other words, what we can prove through historical means is never going to give us the full picture of who Jesus actually was. So the real Jesus is always going to be much bigger and better than what we can prove historically. But that doesn't mean that we should just surrender history and give up. Does that make sense? I think that's a very helpful distinction to make. He employs criteria, and he says it's important because they introduce a measure of objectivity, but it's important that they enable you to change your mind. If after employing your criteria you have never changed your mind about whether something was historical or not, then they're not really acting as an objective guide. Does that make sense? So if you're really using your criteria honestly, there should be things that you thought were historical that after running them through the criteria, you decide, no, that probably wasn't. And there should probably be some things that you didn't think were historical, but once you ran them through your criteria, you're like, well, no, that actually has a good shot at being historical. He's also the one who has probably done the most to rehabilitate John as a historical source. Okay, going through and saying, there's actually a lot of good history here. He argues for Jesus as a marginal Jew. So he and Sanders are both trying to put Jesus in his Jewish context. Sanders kind of emphasizes Jesus as his commonalities with Judaism. Meyer emphasizes his eccentricities within Judaism. Okay, so for Meyer, he's a marginal Jew. So, for example, he's celibate. He also likes the M theme, and so his big themes. Mentor, John the Baptist had the greatest influence on Jesus. His message, he had a kingdom of God emphasis that was distinctive. But Meyer concludes that Matthew 10:23, Mark 9:1, 13:30 were all introduced by the early church. And this is one of those cases where he thought those were probably historical going in. These are the passages like, you won't finish going through all the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Those are usually taken to be likely historical because they seem awkward, because they seem wrong. And why would you invent something wrong that you then have to... But after he runs it through, he decides, no, those are probably early church. This is this generation will not pass away before all these things take place, which again, most people see as likely historical, most scholars see as likely historical because it seems wrong. And then he miracles. Jesus did them, including 3 from John, the paralytic at Bethesda, the man born blind, and the raising of Lazarus. All right? So he is the closest to Sanders, but his Jesus did have disputes over the law, saw the kingdom of God as in some sense present, and was unique. Okay? All right, the last one we will talk about is N.T. Wright. You familiar with N.T. Wright? He has a completely different method. Instead of picking little pieces and trying to build up from the bottom, N.T. Wright says, no. You start with the overall picture and you see how much stuff you can account for. All right, and he calls this critical realism, or hypothesis and verification. You're seeking a consistent picture that can account for the most data, right? And immediately you'll have Jesus scholar types saying, or Jesus seminar types saying, wait a minute, why are you trying to account for the most data when most of that data is going to be secondary and late? Right? So they, push back. But so Wright's Jesus looks the most like the synoptic Jesus of all these people, because he's looking for a Jesus that can fit best with the data. And Sanders, Meyer, and Wright all kind of emphasize the canonical Gospels as being our best sources for getting at Jesus. He says you have to answer 5 questions. 1, how does Jesus fit into Judaism? What were his aims? Why did he die? How and why did the early church begin? And why are the Gospels what they are? And that's a really crucial question. He comes up with the double criterion of similarity and dissimilarity. He says if something is credible in Judaism and credible as a starting point for later Christianity, then you're likely in touch with the historical Jesus. If something is credible within Judaism and credible as a starting point for something that develops in Christianity, then you're likely in touch with the historical Jesus. And he uses this to argue for the historicity of the resurrection. Right? Which you immediately get some say, no, you can't prove the history of resurrection. By definition, it's something outside of history because it's a miracle. History can't prove miracles. He says, yeah, it can. How? Well, it's like, when you throw a rock in a lake and you get the little ripples coming out. Well, if I don't see you throw in the rock, but I look after you've done it, I can see from the ripples and find out where the rock went in, and based on the size and all the ripples, I can, give you a good estimate as to how big the rock was and maybe what shape it was. So he says, if you look at the ripples in the early church, really the only kind of rock that makes sense to make those kind of ripples is the resurrection. Okay? Yeah, well, and he says what you have to explain is how do you get this relatively quick subsequent development of a diverse community, Jews and Gentiles, together worshiping Christ in a monotheistic Christianity. Right? So you have, within a few years, you have Jews and Gentiles worshiping Jesus as God in a monotheistic Christianity. How does that happen? And he says the only way to explain it is if the resurrection actually happened. Does that make sense? How he's using his criterion and doing that. Now, again, you will see some pushback against Wright from more conservatives, because he's come up with, although his picture of Jesus is closest to the Synoptic Gospels, it's still a little bit different than each of the Synoptic Gospels, which means it's essentially a fifth portrait of Jesus. And so you've also got some pushback, why are we trying to construct another portrait of Jesus that is not the same as the canonical witness that we have? Does that make sense? It's still a different Jesus, even though it's closer, but it's different. So, what is the state of the question? And this will be our last slide. There's a growing recognition that criteria are problematical. They can conflict with one another, so multiple attestation is kind of at odds with dissimilarity if you think about it. I think there are ways of applying them, such that they don't have to conflict, or there are situations where one's appropriate and one's not. But 2, they haven't led to greater consensus, and the reason is because they're too easily manipulated. You can kind of use them to, determine whatever you want. There's also a growing recognition that there's not a clear distinction between what is authentic and inauthentic. Right? Say you could conclude that Jesus actually said "but" in one case instead of "and." Does that make the whole saying inauthentic? Well, what's the difference? And what does it mean to be true? What does it mean to be authentic? Does it mean it has to be accurate in all of its details, or is it sufficient if it gets across the gist of what was said or done? Right? And along with this is a growing recognition that our memories are faulty. Right? Every time you recall a memory, you're reshaping it and changing it. And so you'll often get people appealing to the fact that, these were written by eyewitnesses and all that. Even if they were, eyewitnesses misremember stuff all the time. Right? Just look at our criminal justice system. Right? So how do we move forward? Well, there's a growing recognition we have to look at our sources as historical artifacts that must be explained. In other words, instead of looking at the Gospels as sources to be mined for little tidbits, how in the world, or why in the world, did someone write a picture of Jesus like Matthew? Right? If Jesus was like the Jesus Seminar said he was, this wandering, cynic sage, why would somebody write a portrait of him like Matthew and have it be accepted? Or like Mark, or like Luke? Does that make sense? And so there's a growing recognition that we have to accept the testimony for what it is. And if Jesus was as oddball as some of these people have said, how in the world do we end up with what we have? Does that make sense? You've got to be able to explain that. Then there's also a growing look at memory studies, not just how we remember individually, but how we remember as societies and as cultures. Dale Allison, in his book, Constructing Jesus, something like that, he also points out memories are gistified, meaning we tend to remember, we're really bad at remembering details. We're really good at remembering the gist of something, right? Ask somebody what was in the sermon that was just preached. Well, they're not going to be able to recite it back to you word for word, but they can probably give you a good summary of what the main point was, at least hopefully. Right? And so, there we go. And so our memories are themselves kind of gistified. And so what the Gospels are giving us is a picture of the gist of Jesus. Right? What he was. They're not necessarily going for every detail accuracy. They're, again, painting a picture. Does that make sense? All right. We'll stop there.